All right, Mike, you want to get started? You're on mute still.
There we go. I just want to wish everyone a good evening. My name is Michael Davis. Some of you may know me as my alter ego, Austin Gastrell, who is also with us tonight under his pseudonym, Austin Gastrell. But it's a leftover from some meeting exchanges that we had done for past meetings. So apologize for any confusion on the nomenclature, but at any rate, I am the parking program manager with Fairfax County Land Development Services. And tonight we're going to do a presentation that involves a discussion of reimagining parking in Fairfax County. As I mentioned, Austin Gastrell is with me tonight, and he is with the Department of Planning and Development. And he is on the team that is looking at this through the auspices of the zoning ordinance, which is administered by Planning and Development Agency. Land Development Services actually has an administrative role in Article 6 of that ordinance, which involves the parking regulations and parking rates for Fairfax County. So that's why we two agencies are teamed up on this project going forward. I just want to let everyone know that we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A after the presentation. And if you have a question, you can electronically raise your hand to be called upon, as well as opening the conversation after the meeting. So I'll go ahead and start with the presentation tonight. Parking has a profound influence in Fairfax County. With some exceptions, all land uses are required to provide parking. Driving remains a common activity, and developers and property users feel obligated to provide it, even in places where it's not required. However, we must weigh the value of parking against other desirable community elements, such as affordability, equity, the environment, site design, and economic viability. And Austin, I hate to interrupt the presentation, but I don't know that we've advanced off the home screen. There we go. Thank you. The need to provide more parking than necessary and meet confusing and restrictive regulations hinders the accomplishment of these goals. The current regulations encourage placing a higher importance on driving and parking than the possibility of using excess parking to increase housing options, as one example. Regulations create challenges for startup businesses looking for affordable space when needing to meet paper parking requirements. The lack of flexibility creates lost opportunities to adjust development to preserve or enhance community space. Our presentation tonight creates an outline for an enhanced approach to parking regulation in the county, one that looks at the context of development, as well as acknowledging that flexibility and predictability are important considerations for continuing our efforts for better, more compact land design, affordability, and economic growth. The primary goal of this project is right-sizing parking requirements. This concept involves sizing parking to the average demand for it. This approach applies to all areas of the county, from rural, suburban, to high-intensity urban development. This approach, because of these differences in character, different minimum parking requirements should apply. In lower density areas, we propose conventional approaches to parking, but want to avoid burdensome requirements. In medium density areas, we're accommodating innovation, but allowing conventional approaches. In higher density areas, we're pushing for innovation and discouraging conventional approaches. Overall, the next wave of development investment should involve less parking. If we meet the goal of right-sizing parking requirements, then other important goals can be realized. Opportunities for better land stewardship occur, such as designing sites to exchange parking for community and green spaces. Less parking with better land design, access to multiple transportation modes, and a mix of uses dampens the need and desire for personal vehicle travel. From an administrative point of view, simplification and flexibility in our parking requirements is expected to create opportunities beneficial to the community. While we strive to right-size parking and requirements, we also know there are places and uses that present parking challenges. This project continues to evaluate options to address those issues. The Parking Reimagined project is intended to examine and adjust parking requirements and processes to provide community benefits. In our efforts to create places where people want to be, autos and parking must have less influence in design. The Cap One site in Tysons, the Mosaic District in Merrifield, and Reston Town Center are great examples where a walkable, compact, mixed-use urban design has taken precedence over street-oriented surface parking lots that create a vehicle gulf between the roadway and the place you want to be. These Main Street and urban rail and transit accessible places are as much a part of the county's fabric as low-density, tree-covered residential suburban development. Both places and the arc of development in between offer desirable characteristics for living, work, and entertainment. The county needs a balance to thrive, and this includes something as mundane as parking requirements. Our population is diverse. Some want to live in areas where personal travel in cars is unimportant relative to being surrounded by urbanity. Others want to live in a community where green spaciousness is worth a trade-off of driving to access even basic goods and services. This approach to parking seeks to acknowledge and respect these diverse perspectives. Further, we want to diminish obstacles to business opportunities. Meeting arcane parking requirements and rates designed for more car-centric activities of 30 to 40 years ago constrains new business ventures, reinforces poor land and environmental management activities, and creates opportunity costs for uses that will provide community benefit, such as more affordable housing. All of this helps the county succeed. With continued evaluation of a parking framework with our consultant, Nelson Nygaard, staff has created a proposed approach, which is depicted here. With the intent of right-sizing parking, this is particularly important where the densities and intensities of development allow for greater innovation in approaches. Thus, this map shows a concentration of areas subject to lower parking requirements. At least 90% of the county's land area will remain subject to baseline requirements with some proposed modifications. Lower minimum parking requirements are focused on areas defined in the comprehensive plan as growth areas. In this framework, the following tiers are proposed. In suburban centers, we want to recognize that while development in these areas is of relatively lower density, the concentration of development within these areas provides opportunities for modest connectivity and shared activities that reduce parking demand. A 10% baseline reduction is proposed. Revitalization areas, such as community business centers, commercial revitalization areas, and commercial revitalization districts, are proposed for a baseline 20% reduction, which is consistent with today's standards. Transit station areas and the Tysons Urban Center are areas adjacent to TOD areas and are proposed to have a 30% baseline reduction. These areas are generally planned for higher density mixed-use development with good access to Metro Rail, as well as higher quality transit availability and a more walkable environment. Transit-oriented development areas, which are known as TODs, are proposed to have a baseline 40% reduction in the minimum parking requirements. These are areas within 1/2 mile of a metro station. Since many of these areas are planned for development that complements Metro Rail, with higher density and intensity in compact urban designs, parking should be minimized to support the rail and transit investments and create a pedestrian-scaled community. For TOD, we're also proposing that property owners could adopt PTC low or no minimum requirements and parking maximums through the rezoning entitlement process or a staff-administered process. Planned Transit Tysons, also referenced as PTC zoning, are sites within the Tysons Urban Center that have been rezoned to the PTC district or have opted into the PTC through a staff-administered process. The Tysons Urban Center is the county's downtown with the highest allowable densities. With acceptance of the PTC designation, property owners have low or no minimum parking requirements and maximum parking requirements. The project proposes to retain these criteria for the Tysons Urban Center. The parking rates and area reductions under consideration with this project generally affect minimum requirements. Caps on parking, known as maximums, are only proposed with development that chooses to opt in to no minimum requirement. This option would only be available in the Tysons PTC and in transit-oriented development districts. I note also that we have been looking at the relationship of accessible parking to parking reduction efforts. Our intent is to base this on the baseline minimums, even in areas and circumstances where parking reductions can occur. Now I'll turn this presentation over to Austin.
Thank you, Mike. The next few slides show examples of base or minimum parking rates being examined by this project. The existing single-family attached dwelling or townhouse rate is 2.7 spaces per unit, with one space having convenient access to the street. In response to concerns regarding lack of available visitor or shared parking in townhouse communities, we are proposing to alter or redistribute the existing single-family attached rate by requiring that 0.7 spaces of the 2.7 spaces required per unit are provided for visitor or shared use. Reductions of the single-family dwelling rates are currently only proposed in the TSA, TOD, and PTC districts. So there would be no proposed reduction of the rate in the suburban center, commercial revitalization districts or revitalization areas. The proposed multifamily family dwelling rate under consideration is 1.3 to 1.6 spaces per dwelling unit. This is an example of parking rate right sizing. The Institute of Transportation Engineers maintains national parking demand data through their document Parking Generation. ITE's data shows that the national average parking demand for suburban, non-transit served multifamily dwellings is 1.3 spaces per unit. Staff is also considering the possibility of a proposed multifamily dwelling rate based on bedroom number. The proposed restaurant rate under consideration is between 8 and 10 spaces per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area, and between 8 and 10 spaces per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area of outdoor seating in excess of 1,000 square feet. This is an example of rate right sizing and simplification. The size of a building or tenant space is a known factor throughout all phases of a project's lifespan. By transitioning to a single rate solely based on square footage, we can provide greater predictability for property owners and prospective tenants. The proposed retail sales rate under consideration is between 3 and 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area. This is an example of right sizing. Our current retail sales rate has not been revised since 1978. Since then, significant changes in shopping behavior have occurred, such as online sales, which lower parking demand. Local and national data shows that average non-December parking demand for all retail uses is below the current county requirement. Please note that this retail sales rate applies to a single standalone building or use. A building that has 2 or more retail type uses is considered a shopping center. The example on this side shows how the proposed retail sales rate would transition or decrease through the tiered framework. The minimum parking requirement or base rate would decline by 10% in the suburban centers, 20% in the revitalization areas, 30% in the TSA or transit station areas, and 40% in the TOD or transit-oriented development areas. Please note that this project does not seek to change the maximum parking requirements which currently exist in the PTC district. The existing office parking rate was last updated in 1988 when the 3 current rates were adopted. We are proposing to simplify this into 2 rates based on building size. The proposed office rate range under consideration for an office under 50,000 square feet is between 3 and 3.6 spaces per 1,000 square feet. And the range under consideration for an office over 50,000 square feet is 2 to 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet. Similar to retail uses, office parking demand has changed in the last 35 years. Remote working and flexible in-office schedules were becoming more commonplace prior to the pandemic, lowering average parking needs for offices. Further within the county, rail and bus transit services have expanded, providing travel alternative to certain areas of the county. National survey data demonstrates that average parking demand for all office types is less than the current county requirement. This example shows how parking requirements for an office over 50,000 square feet would translate through the tiered framework. The minimum parking requirement would decline by 10% in each tier from the proposed base rate all the way up to a transit-oriented development. This is also an example of parking rate right sizing or right sizing of a minimum requirement. The proposed warehouse rate shown is an example of rate simplification. Many industrial uses have a parking rate based on number of employees and company vehicles, but a minimum of 1 space per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area. We're proposing to simplify this rate by basing it on the square footage of the building or the number of employees, whichever is less. And I do apologize, I noted that's not on the screen. So what we're proposing is 1 space per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area or 1 space per employee, whichever is less. The size of a building can be determined at all phases of a project's lifespan, and parking can be supplied accordingly. Numbers of company vehicles is not a constant, which can require excess parking to be provided. A requirement to provide additional parking can create hardships and prevent establishments of new businesses. Basing of the proposed rate on square footage or number of employees, whichever is less, also allows for flexibility to address specific needs of a business while also reducing conflicts which can arise when a new or prospective tenant comes to take over or move into a new tenant space. It is our intent to release draft parking rates organized by use category incrementally throughout the summer and early fall. These releases will align with our future scheduled parking reimagined open houses, just like tonight's open house. Drafts will be available on the webpage under the Documents tab. Clean and strike-through versions with footnotes explaining proposed changes are currently available on our webpage for residential uses, agricultural uses, and industrial uses. Draft rates for the commercial use or public use category will also be posted on the webpage within the coming weeks. Since the kickoff of this project in October of 2021, we have conducted nearly 50 meetings, which include 50 project meetings, which include supervisor-sponsored town halls, individual project meetings with all board members, as well as meetings with board advisory committees, community service groups, community associations, industry groups, and internal county agencies to discuss and seek feedback on this project. Since January, we've met monthly with our community project work group to discuss elements of the proposal and gain their perspectives. These discussions have been important in modifying our proposals and framing our public discussions of them. Our initial public outreach efforts focused on values and rationales associated with this project. Our current phase of engagement is intended to give the community the ability to react and comment on tangible proposals. The updated project timeline before you shows our goal of bringing a complete proposal back to the Planning Commission and Board in early of 2023. Lastly, as stated, we have a project webpage that's regularly updated with information and opportunities for the public to participate in the Parking Reimagined project. Thank you for your time, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. And I will say that if you don't feel comfortable speaking on camera or being on camera, you can also activate the chat. The chat function should be in that toggle bar you had, and you can put a message or a question in the chat, and we'll be able to respond to that.
Anybody have any comments tonight? Questions, observations about the project?
Oh, we're taking comments and questions. Jim asked that in the in the chat. This is kind of an open forum if you have any questions or comments regarding the project.
I'm sorry, I have a comment, or comments or observations. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, so my name is Brooks, and I live and work in the Providence district near Merrifield. And so first I want to say that I'm encouraged that our parking policies are being reviewed, and that reductions in parking minimums are being considered. I think that's a really good step for us, not just in my district, but in the county as a whole. And so, well, one thing I wanted to comment on is just kind of one concern I have is if we're being forward-looking in the way we craft this. I think I read that the last time these policies were opened up was back in the 80s. I might be wrong about that. I thought I read that somewhere, and I'm sure we're projected to grow even more in the coming decades, and places become more dense, whether our current policies encourage that or not, just the nature of the area we live in. And so when we talk about parking minimums, and it seems to me like the areas that we're honing in on are very small in scope, limited to where there's currently a metro station and maybe a mile radius within that. And there's cities all across North America who have both considered and enacted elimination of their parking minimums, because it's for a lot of the reasons that were touched on in here. It's can be a barrier to economic development. It's a barrier to equity, and it encourages the minimums often encourage the car dominance. So I'm hoping that with any changes that are made, that we can look forward into the future, to our future growth, and not just react to where we're currently bursting at the seams. I would encourage a further reduction or elimination, especially in transit corridors, of the minimums, with the normal caveats of accessible parking for those who need it. Bicycle parking minimums, I know I saw that listed in the white paper outing. I think that's something we want to see. We want to see more of, as our districts start to urbanize more and more. More and more people are choosing those alternative modes of transportation. And so my other comment was about the demand, right? The demand for parking. We have different approaches for different areas based on the demand. And then there's people who are still going to need to drive. That's understandable. But I would want to comment that in a lot of these spaces, the reason that we have such a high demand for that parking is it's by design, because these are places that are designed for car dominance. And I think these parking minimums play a role in that. If we can peel these back a little further, we can make places that are pleasant to be in. We can make places that are more affordable to be in, more equitable, more safe, more healthy for all of us. So, yeah, thanks for the presentation. And those are my comments.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll let Mike respond if he wants to, and then if Mike's going to respond after that, Pranav Europe.
I'll just comment briefly. This is the approach that we're looking at is to kind of address the comment about how broad we're looking at, the broadness or the lack thereof, with looking at more innovative approaches. The county is kind of uniquely positioned. I mean, from my own personal perspective, I would like to move toward no parking minimums, but the county itself is in a position where we have this very diverse geography, if you will, in that we have these very rural areas and we have these higher density urban areas, and we're trying to encourage development to be targeted more to these higher density urban areas. So the approach that we're taking with Parking Reimagined is to try to align with that and really move this innovation toward those areas that we expect higher density and intensity development. I think that it still leaves the circumstance open for additional discussion about, you know, are the reduction proposals that we have, should they be broader? Should they be something that is applied more beyond what we're proposing? That's certainly out there for discussion. But at this point, we feel as though, you know, to try to address this diversity circumstance, that this tiered approach, this tiered structure is going to address the areas that really need an innovative approach to be considered.
All right, Pranav, and then after Pranav, we will address Fran's comment about ADA parking, and then Alexis's comment regarding bike parking minimums. Pranav, the floor is
Oh,
yours.
totally. So hi, everyone. Sorry to cut you off there. My name is Pranav Chadri, and I serve as the Drainesville District Representative on the Fairfax County Young Adults Advisory Council. I wanted to echo Brooks's initial comments on kind of the scale and the scope about how we approach this. You know, we do not have a lot of time on climate change, and we as young people, I think, see it as really imperative to really take a structural approach to how we look at these kinds of things. And as far as I've examined from living in this county, a lot of young people cannot afford to live here, and parking lots are bad for the environment. They increase runoff into local streams and rivers. They take away space that can be used for housing, and they subsidize car dependence. And in many cases, that has really had negative impacts on our residents, both in terms of, you know, the health impacts of commuting, and even just when you look at places like Bailey's Crossroads, like Seven Corners, where there have been scores of pedestrian deaths in large part due to us subsidizing car culture. And so I really want to say, I think it's important that we take a really comprehensive look, but also that young people are kind of brought into those conversations, right? Because I think a lot of those community meetings may not necessarily be the most representative of the population that's going to be the future of Fairfax County. And I hope that that can be more broadly represented, both in these kinds of discussions as well as with supervisors one-on-one. And so I wanted to really express my support for expanding the tier 3 zones to include all of those metro TODs, because I honestly don't see the appeal of maintaining parking minimums in areas right around a metro stop, especially when those are areas where there's been a lot of dense housing that's been built. And you know, the county has placed a lot of faith in TODs in terms of this economic imperative that is going to be necessary to drive our county's growth. And yet, oftentimes, those TODs are still car-centric. And so, yeah, I just kind of wanted to note, I think a need for digging further, especially into right around metro stations and how we can best use that space.
Yeah, I would agree with you with regard to this project and trying to orient the highest amount of reduction to the metro stations, because one of the linchpins of this relationship is the county and others have invested a great deal of money in the metro system and extending the metro system. And so we want to get value from that. And one of the ways to get value is to try not to encourage people to be driving to these station areas. We want people to be living, working, entertained in those areas and not have as much influence from the automobile, and designing these communities to be less auto-centric. So I appreciate the comments associated with that, and we'll continue to be looking at the relationship between parking and transit, not only metro, but other transit options.
All right, and thank you, Pranav. And I would say that if you have any comments or any suggestions of how to get more young people involved in this type of an outreach, on our webpage, we do have a email for the project, and we'd be happy to take any comments or any recommendations to get different groups of people involved in this type of public meeting. So next, we're going to respond to Fran's question, and Fran asks, "How does ADA parking fit into this plan?" Mike, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. We've got a couple of things that we're trying to think about with regard to ADA parking. One of the things that was mentioned in the presentation is that there are opportunities for reductions that are built in to the tiered framework. The county also has options for parking reductions that are outside of the tiered framework that that we currently have, as well as potentially modifying those to provide more options and flexibility. But one of the things that we've thought about is, with regard to supply particularly, is to ensure that even if we're reducing parking, that we're still providing adequate accessibility spaces, or the adequate number of accessibility spaces. And part of that is driven by the ratios that we use to determine the number of accessible spaces with any given project. And that's based on the number of parking spaces that are provided with any particular development. And, if we're reducing that supply, then conceivably the number of ADA spaces could also be reduced. So we're proposing having some language in the ordinance that basically creates a stasis for accessible parking. So from that point of view, whatever the base requirement for parking, whether it's through these percentage reductions or through a parking reduction proposal, that the accessible parking needs to be related to whatever was originally required. So that's one circumstance that we are looking at. But a number of other comments that we've gotten relate to location of ADA spaces, the relationship of ADA spaces to the building, and those sorts of things. And part of this project that has been alluded to in other conversations this evening is we're trying to create an ability to build more compact development, more development that's oriented to the street, and also provide more walkability between parking and development, if parking is still needed, or create more walkable communities in general. So from that point of view, putting buildings closer to the street brings down the distance that you would have to get from parking on the street to the building entrance. Having parking be more accessible to the pedestrian network, to be able to get from a parking area to a building, is also something that is kind of an overarching goal as part of, as I said, developing more compact walkable communities. So there's that element that comes into it as well. And we certainly have had been giving more attention to, I don't know if this project can really change the design characteristics for accessible parking and locating accessible parking. It's more of a, we have a public facilities manual that gets more in depth with that. And this ordinance is not really focused on accessibility, but it's certainly in our minds, and we're trying to do what we can to enhance accessibility opportunities wherever we can with the other changes that we're making or proposing as part of the project.
Great. Really quick, I just saw in the chat that Pranav had mentioned something about the maps. I think you're looking at our previous map. There should be an updated map on the webpage as well that kind of shows our new proposal which is in line with our comprehensive plan land units. So next I'll address Alexis's comment regarding bicycle parking, and after that I'm going to go to Mike, who's had his hand up, and then Jim in the comments. So to Alexis's question is that are bicycle parking minimums included at all tiers or zones? We are currently looking into bicycle parking minimums and looking at how we can implement bicycle parking minimums in certain districts, and if we can implement those things. So we've been working in correlation with Fairfax County Department of Transportation, who is currently going through a rewrite of their bicycle parking minimums to determine how we can incorporate bicycle parking into our ordinance, let it be through minimums or through incentivizing bicycle parking structures as part of further reductions, or as just part of ways to trying to find ways to incentivize people to put that in. So yes, it is something we're looking at, and stay tuned. We should in the near future have more coming out about proposals regarding bicycle parking minimums. And then Mike, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I am not a resident of Fairfax County, but my company is looking to possibly move their headquarters there in the coming years. And as somebody who commutes to work on the metro, I'm worried that still requiring so much parking will lead to heavy car traffic around the metro, which could make walking from the metro to offices near the metro hazardous for pedestrians. And I'd also just like to ask if you're aware of the fact that people have criticized the ITE's methodology with parking generation rates for being not relevant to areas with good transit access, and also for not having relationships that are necessarily statistically significant, or at least significant enough to warrant the numbers they use.
Yeah, to go ahead. I was going to address that comment really quick. Do you have anything else that you wanted to add?
No, that's it.
Okay, so I'd like to note that, so we do have a consultant, Nelson Nygaard and Clarion. We have two consultants that are helping us with this project. And as part of that, we've done jurisdictional peer research and national research of different peers. While ITE rates have been a source of data, they have not been the only data we have been going off of. And to the comment regarding suburban areas and non-suburban areas, and just kind of basing it on geography, going back to kind of Mike's earlier point, the county is extremely diverse. I grew up in the southern part of the county where there was no public transit, and there still to this day is very limited public transit. Whereas there's a difference between the southern part of the county and some areas like, Lorton and Clifton, places like that, compared to Tyson's Corner, Reston, places that have more public transit accessibility. So we're trying to figure a way to not have a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's kind of why our tiered framework, we believe, is a good proposal to say that it addresses the needs of those different areas based on locational characteristics. But Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I just wanted to touch on the comment about parking generation, and there is an awareness of what parking generation surveys, and a lot of their parking surveys are related to suburban uses, suburban sites. And so we've tried to keep that in mind as part of our thoughts associated with rates, in the sense that the base rates that we have do have some information that is sourced from parking generation, but the base rates are intended to be related to more suburban development. So there's a correlation there. And, when you look at the tiered framework, it's based on whatever the base rate is, and then you have percentage reductions that go for the higher density areas. So I think in some regard, we've tried to compensate for that with regard, tried to compensate that with our proposal for reductions in areas where, parking generation, may not have a lot of urban survey data for many uses. And so that, the percentage reductions that we're looking at kind of address that circumstance and try to account for it. There are some, the latest edition of parking generation does have some additional survey data for some uses, particularly multifamily, that are stratified by urban and transit accessibility. So there is some better data in parking generation. I'm not going to say that it's the end all be all, and certainly any publication of that nature is not the end all be all with regard to, what you would use for this type of exercise. So as Austin said, we've been doing our own survey work in the county, keeping it county relevant. And most of that was done pre-pandemic. So we have that information. And as Austin also alluded to, we have a consultant that also has access to a great deal of information and is certainly in the realm of thinking about, the limitations associated with ITE's parking generation. So just wanted to clarify that a little bit to answer your question.
Thanks so much, Mike. So Jim's comment is next, which is in the chat. And Jim says that it is disappointing that the illusion of additional green space keeps coming up. If there's not some actual requirement, some trade-off for a parking reduction, it isn't going to happen, particularly on residential developments. If the developers don't have to do it, they won't. They'll just provide less parking. When this project was announced, the wonderful environmental benefit, green space and tree save instead of concrete or asphalt, was supposed to be the rationale. But now there is nothing but a meaningless voluntary possibility. Has staff vetoed putting required green space back into the equation? Jim further says that on affordability of housing, why would a developer lower the rent or price below the market rate, absent some requirement? How does this amendment lower housing prices? Is the idea that developers would generously reduce rent or prices just because the parking requirements are relaxed? Couldn't they just pocket the savings as profit under this proposal? So I'll let Mike respond to part of your questions, Jim, and then I'll also respond to part of your question regarding green space. No, it's not out of the question. It's something we're absolutely looking into. It's something that we want to make sure that environmental stewardship is something that we always reward and try to incentivize. And what was mentioned earlier in this project, not in tonight's meeting, is that based on concerns regarding green space and regarding saving of green space in some cases, or adding to green spaces in some cases, as it relates to parking lots, we've had a separate zoning ordinance amendment that has been spawned related specifically to parking lot landscaping and transitional screening requirements. So we have not we have not gotten rid of the environmental stewardship part of this. We understand that excess parking lots do create heat islands. They do create excess stormwater runoff. So even by reducing excess impervious surface, we do reduce those types of environmental issues. Now, when it comes to a trade-off, we're looking, like I said, we are looking into ways to incentivize green space within the county and incentivize developers and property owners to increase green space in some cases. So, Mike, would you like to respond to this comment, Jim's comment, as well as the comment regarding affordability and how this impacts affordability?
Sure. The one other thing that I wanted to add to Austin's comment is, as we presented this project initially, there were a number of values that we were looking at with regard to the relationship of parking, supply, and other factors that other benefits, if you will, that would come with reducing parking supply. Environment was one of them and still remains one of them, but looking at economic benefit, looking at affordability, looking at equity are also important factors associated with the project. So as Austin detailed, we're still looking at the environmental part of this and how that fits. But I guess to kind of transition to address the affordability question, as most of you know, there is an expense associated with building and maintaining parking. And the more parking that you have, or the more structured parking that you have to build, the more investment that requires. And from that point of view, it also dampens the ability for affordable housing providers to build their projects, because they go through a pro forma, just like anybody else. You're buying a house, you're trying to make a decision about, can you afford the house, and what are the costs and benefits associated with that? A developer of affordable housing goes through that same exercise. And if they have to build parking or an excessive amount of parking, then that has to be factored into the cost, and it may prevent someone from building an affordable housing product. So that's a direct correlation between cost and benefit. and it's something that we want to, we wanted to provide flexibility within the ordinance to achieve our affordable housing goals and not have those affordable housing goals hampered by parking requirements. The other thing I will say about parking cost, is that particularly with multifamily, there is an inherent cost with parking in the sense that if a multifamily developer is building parking for the project, that is factored into the rent for that project. So the homeowners or the renters will be paying an additional cost associated with parking. One of the things that can be done to alleviate that is to allow a choice, in the sense that if you're moving into a multifamily community, a multifamily community can have what is called unbundled parking, which means it's not associated with the rent for that particular unit. And it gives the consumer the opportunity to make a decision on how much parking they will buy. They could buy no space, they could buy one space, or potentially two spaces. And so it becomes part of the cost analysis that goes into someone renting an apartment. And clearly, if you don't have to purchase a space extra, then that is a savings in your monthly rent.
Thank you, Mike. So Tammy's got their hand up. Tammy, you have the floor.
Thank you. I applaud you for mentioning that one size does not fit all. But what I'm really concerned in, and I will tell you, I've been on the Reston Planning and Zoning Committee for a number of years, and have worked for 2.5 years on the environmental stewardship chapter of the ongoing, currently being written Reston Comprehensive Plan. So I have some knowledge about Reston and about what's going on here. And I will say, I will applaud the day when the silo thinking about parking goes away and the vision of a tree becomes not a piece of vegetation, but a necessary component or element of good design, of livable design. You all, I'm sure, because I did, just went through a hellacious storm. This is not going to change. These storms are getting more frequent. What does this have to do with parking? What it has to do with parking is, if you're going to reduce parking, the space that you're not using for parking, that you're reducing, must be, not considered, must be relegated to, or enhanced or elevated to, an area where vegetation, hopefully trees, are planted to offset the climate change we're getting from heat islands and places where parking is such an enormous concern. Marketers have told us at the planning committee that they have to provide the number of spaces, or parking spaces that renters require, or they can't rent the units. We have a famous element in Fairfax, in Reston, where the developer shorted their parking by about 40 or 45 spaces, and those people roam around and park on the streets and take up parking from other nearby communities. It's a lot of multifamily in that one area near Reston Town Center. It's a classic example. We use it in almost every case. So the answer to your conundrum of what do we do here is very complicated. One's answer does not fit all. Parking in residential areas is incredibly important. People have to get to work to make money, to pay their taxes and rent. It's not an if, it's a must. The other issue is, I heard something that made my blood run a little cold. You talked about in the urban areas, getting the buildings closer to the street. That's one of the problems. In addition to the lack of trees that can mitigate some of the climate change and heat island effect, we're now finding out that the public facilities manual is talking about, are you ready? Reducing the minimum measurements of tree planting, boxes. Are you serious? I mean, our planet is on fire and we have a real problem here. So thank you for the work you're doing, but please, please don't have it be a consideration of adding green space where you're taking away parking. Have it be a requirement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Mike, if you'd like to respond, go ahead, and Brian will take your question next.
No, I just briefly, I mean, as Austin alluded to earlier, the parking lot, landscaping, and other opportunities for planting of trees is something that we are actively looking at. It's allied, it's similar to the situation that we've had with on-street parking versus off-street parking. We're working with FCDOT on that to coordinate on this project. And a similar thing is going on with regard to what we're looking at in the ordinance and landscaping requirements. And so hopefully there can be some allied effort. I think both projects are basically tracking together at this point. And so hopefully that will lead to some allied efforts to address tree preservation, additional plantings, and that sort of thing, particularly in the urban environments, because, we're not, for us, street trees are a part of the urban streetscape. Even if the buildings are closer to the street, we still want this tree planting strip and other opportunities for green space within these higher density areas. So that's something that we're continuing to look at in alliance with our project.
All right, Mike. So Brian says, has the county estimated how quickly property owners in the affected areas are likely to respond to relaxed regulations by reclaiming parking spaces for other purposes? So Brian, I'll respond to your question, and that, it really depends. It's something that when and if, when new regulations become approved, if we reduce parking rates, it does allow for someone to then evaluate their parking, and it becomes a choice of a property owner or a developer or someone who currently has a site to say, do I have an excess that allows me to redevelop or to redesign a site, to look at, what are important factors that they believe that they would like to add to their site. Let it be green space, let it be community benefits, let it be additional uses on a property in some cases. And so how quickly it could happen really depends. This is a project that looks at the long-term goals. It looks at setting regulations for future development in many cases, but also having that new requirements and having new requirements for development when it comes to minimum parking requirements does allow for property owners to begin the conversation and begin brainstorming how they can then use that excess space they have on their property. So it could be something that would be, I wouldn't say quickly done, but it's not going to be something that's going to be 10 years down the road. It could be seen, within a shorter period of time. Mike, did you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, just to kind of dovetail on Austin's comments, there are a number of components associated with this project that we're looking at. Some of them have more longer term implications, as Austin indicated. Some of them could be more short term in the sense that if we are trying to make our analysis processes operate better, meaning it's easier because you don't have to meet a paper parking requirement for certain uses or a certain collection of uses, or if it's easier to interpret what parking needs to be provided on a site, if it provides some flexibility to reduce parking in the tiered framework, those types of situations that are existing development may happen sooner with regard to parking conformity and easing the process to get an approval for a use permit and those types of things. But also, change is sometimes very slow to come about. My role in the county is to look at parking reductions and parking supply issues. And so from that point of view, Tyson's has been a situation, the Tyson's Corner area has had the ability to have no minimum parking for more than 10 years now. And we have not seen any proposal that would really take strong advantage of that. A lot of the development still meets that range between the minimum and the between no minimum and a maximum, and kind of falls in the middle, or tries to design parking for what they perceive their need to be. And so, the horizon for more innovative approaches to parking may be longer than the more practical circumstances that we deal with on a day-to-day basis to try to, as I said, get a permit or be in conformance with the parking ordinance.
All right, Mike, thank you. Alexis asked, can we please explain why the size of 1,000 square feet is used for determining minimum parking spaces? The average size of a one-bedroom apartment in Northern Virginia is 800 square feet, requiring car parking minimums of 2, 3, and 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet seems excessive in context to residential. So I would say that when it comes to residential rates, we're looking at per unit in most cases, or per bedroom is a conversation we've had. Residential parking rates are based off of units and not square footage. The square footage requirement is a known quantity, and in a lot of cases what we're doing is determining the existing rates we have and right sizing them, bringing them into the 2022 and beyond. And so trying to streamline our regulations in a way that they're consistent. And one of the ways to do that is that how do we write regulations that are understandable and that are transparent to county, citizens, residents, as well as people wanting to do business in Fairfax County. And one of those ways is using square footage as a known quantity. And 1,000 square feet is just kind of the common norm for X amount of spaces per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area of a use. Let it be a restaurant, let it be a warehouse, let it be anything like that. Square footage is generally always a known quantity. That's why we're using square footage. But in residential districts, when it comes to residential development, single family attached, detached, multifamily housing, we're looking at a per unit rate and possibly a per bedroom rate as something we could be looking at with multifamily. All right. So Pranav had a question. Has there been any consideration given to expanding PTC style requirements in other non-Tyson's TSAs? Is there a reason why the more recent version of the proposal only decreases minimums by 30 to 40% rather than doing away with them around other metro stations? Mike, would you like to answer that?
Sure. As part of the tiered framework, we are actually trying to expand the PTC circumstance to the TOD areas, to the other TODs in the county. So, the Reston TODs, on the Silver Line corridor, and other TODs on the Orange Line, Merrifield, Vienna, we're looking at having the same option, if you will, with regard to either opting in through or getting an entitlement, which is similar to the PTC. When you're in Tyson's, there's a zoning category that we have called Plan Tyson's Corner. And you can file a zoning request to be zoned to that district. And when you're zoned to that district, there are a number of things that go into it. But one of the things that go into it is parking. And that's where you can either park to no minimum or a low minimum, but you also have a parking maximum. And so we're looking to see if we can extend that to the other metro stations to either come through an entitlement or come through an opt-in process, which is an administrative process. And we've been using that in Tyson's, and we've had a number of developments who have opted in, including Tyson's Mall, Tyson's Corner Center has opted in to the no minimum maximum framework. So, and they don't have PTC zoning. So that, I think that to answer your question, we are trying to expand that capability and to try to use that more innovative approach at the other metro stations in the county.
All right. I believe Tammy, you are up.
Thank you. One short and point is that our TSA areas in Reston are quote urban, but we do not have urban transportation, infrastructure in buses that can cover all of Reston or even outside of Reston. So many people, even though they may work near a metro station, and that's highly, as you're aware, highly dense with jobs, they have to drive. And my concern is, and then we have the retail situation, which is in the perfect flux of where are we going with retail? Nobody really knows right now where we're going with retail. We thought brick and mortar was going away. Well, it's starting to come back. So we're in this crazy post-pandemic, oh, gee, are we really out of the pandemic situation? So my prayer to you is that try parking reduction, but don't eliminate the ability to add back spaces if there needs to be extra spaces. If they're put into landscaping and trees and vegetation, you can remove that. God, you'd hate to do that because it does mitigate the climate change, but you could if you needed to. For once you put another building on that site and developers want to monetize every square inch, instead of having a fantastic plan, they will have a crappy plan and they will monetize everything. So if you eliminate the parking and they put a building up there, you can't get that parking ever back. So you're playing a gambling game with the economic success of the area. And we don't really know where we're going now. So I would encourage, please be very conservative on when you make your final recommendations. And if you make a mistake, and it wouldn't be your fault, it's just the way, we don't know, it's an estimate, then the parking can be added back in. Thank you.
We have just to briefly address that, we have, or at least I have, in working with developers, gotten some set aside areas, as you describe, where we keep it as green or open space. And then if the parking is needed at some point, that can be converted to parking. And, what we're banking on in those situations is that we're never going to need that parking. So it always remains green space. But that, I would agree with you that under certain circumstances, that having that sort of land bank area for parking is something that I don't know if it's codifiable in the ordinance, but certainly something that we try to look for when we're looking at development applications and other circumstances.
And quickly to add to what Mike said, I would just make the important point that in many of these transit station areas and transit-oriented development type areas or TODs, redevelopment of a site will require an entitlement in a lot of cases. So it'll require a amendment, a proper condition amendment, a final development plan amendment, which will then open up conversation regarding conditions or proffers of use for the property. So for by right development, there is the by right option of what can happen, but in most of the TSA, TOD type areas, there is a pretty strict kind of regulation regarding the entitlements already in place, and then substantial redevelopment would require amendments to those entitlements. Jason, you're up next, and then after Jason, we will address Jim's comment in the chat. Go ahead, Jason.
Hi, thank you very much for doing this presentation to all of us. Very, very much appreciate it. My question is on trip generation by cycling. I see everything here is driven by metro.
Can't really hear you, Jim. Or Jason, can you speak into the microphone? Still can't hear you there, Jason. Oh, You'll type the question. Sounds good. Go ahead. So while Jason is typing his question, I will address Jim's question of, don't we need more loading spaces? With the change in technology, internet shopping, more frequent deliveries like Amazon and FedEx, is this amendment going to clarify anything about the importance of loading space and the absence of loading spaces and how it can affect the utility of the disabled spaces? Mike, would you like to address loading and kind of what we're looking at loading?
Sure. And part of it is there are two types of, or even more, depending on how you look at it, of loading that are discussed in the context of development applications. So the loading, the more traditional loading is usually associated with a loading dock. It's a covered space, or it's a space dedicated on a part of the building where larger items can be loaded and unloaded. Sometimes, FedEx or something like that will use that area for loading for uses on the site. But the other loading that is talked about more often of late is the ability for, as you said, Amazon, FedEx, and other delivery options that are small parcels, essentially, to be able to have a place to sit or park and then bring those goods into the building for delivery. And so from that point of view, we have a lot of developers that will set aside spaces either within the garage or parking area to allow that sort of short-term loading. There's no county requirement associated with that at this point, but developers typically recognize that this type of service is needed and a benefit to the development. The other thing that developers will want to do is do like an eyebrow or something like that in the front of the building to be able to bring a truck in to do that sort of loading. But then I guess the third element of loading that is also kind of part of the conversation is Uber and Lyft and other ride sharing services being able to get as close to the building as possible to pick up passengers or discharge passengers. And a lot of times this eyebrow treatment that I spoke of kind of doubles as that loading for Uber and Lyft, as well as small parcel delivery services.
So yeah, to Mike's comments, there's a lot of different types of loading, and we're looking at the possibilities for what our ordinance and what can be changed in our ordinance with regards to loading. And I would say that generally when it comes to loading or large loading, so your 18-wheeler type loading, we've seen rates be higher in a lot of cases than averages, and it being one of the most commonly and frequently requested type of requirement to be waived during a zoning entitlement. And so we are looking into that larger type of loading to right size those rates based on just general data for things like restaurants with drive-through. Actually, that's actually stacking. That's something else we're looking at. But your different types of uses that have that loading space, as well as stacking spaces, and how we can right size those comments or those rates. So it looks like Jason asked their comment in the chat and said, has there been any look at trip generation based on cycling? For example, the W and O and D corridor. Like I said, we're working with FCDOT, who I'm sure is looking into those types in the trip generation, but it is a good comment and something we'll take a look at. Thanks so much. Okay, does anyone else have any comments, questions, concerns? I would like to say that These meetings are posted on our webpage. We'll have videos, recordings of these meetings, as well as we have a list of future meetings for public engagement and opportunities for public engagement. We have, I believe it's the 27th, it's the last Saturday of the month. We're actually going to have an open house as well, just like this. And we'll be scheduling other weekday type open houses. So I would say that if you, on the screen currently is our Parking Reimagined webpage, to stay in tune with that webpage for future opportunities to participate in this project. And would also like to mention again that the current proposed draft rates or minimum requirements for agricultural uses, industrial uses, and residential uses is currently posted on the webpage in a clean version and a strike-through version, strike-through and underline, highlighting what is proposed to being changed with footnotes explaining the changes. On our webpage, there's an email address for this amendment, which we would encourage you to take a look at those rates and give us your comments on those via the email address on the webpage. Again, just like to open it up if anyone has any last comments or questions. Mike, do you have anything to say?
I was just going to say that I appreciate the participation tonight. It's been a very good conversation, a lot of good comments, constructive comments, and very good questions about what we're doing and aspirations associated with the project. So I'm glad that we've had this level of participation tonight, and look forward to further conversations as we continue with our project.
Yep. And like we said, we'll have future open houses as well as be doing more community outreach throughout the fall and the end of this summer. So if we have no other questions, I want to thank everyone for your time and joining us tonight. Have a safe night. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you.